Everyone laughed when the old fisherman was digging in the sand by the shore, thinking he was just looking for trash. But when he unearthed a massive, rusted anchor and realized what it was attached to, he was overcome with horror. A few days later, the military arrived and completely sealed off the coastline. No one could believe what had been hiding underwater all this time. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The sea around the northern island always seemed older than time itself. It stretched endlessly toward the horizon, cold and gray, with low clouds dragging across the peaks of dark cliffs. The waves spoke in murmurs that only a few men could understand, and among those few was Eli Wilson. For most of his 60-odd years, he had lived by these waters, watching them rise and fall, taking what they gave and mourning what they claimed. The wind was his only neighbor, the gulls his witnesses. His house stood alone near a curve of the shore where jagged stones broke the surf, and behind it, spruce trees shivered under the constant breath of the Arctic. Every morning, Eli rose before dawn. He would light the small oil lamp, listen to the creaking of the old boards, then make coffee from the tin that never left the kitchen shelf. His boat, Mariner's Rest, waited by the rotting pier, a narrow wooden craft that had outlasted every other vessel in the village. He would move through his preparations silently, boots on, nets folded, fuel checked. He did not speak aloud. There was no one to answer. His wife, Sarah, had been gone for almost 10 years. After she died, the house grew quiet, and Eli learned to fill that silence with the rhythm of the waves and the ticking of the stove. The island community was small, barely 20 people scattered along the coast. They all depended on the sea. Fish, kelp, and the occasional seal were the only reasons their little settlement still existed. Eli was among the oldest fishermen left, a man others respected but rarely visited. They said he had become part of the landscape, like the rocks, like the wind. He accepted that with no bitterness. Age, solitude, and loss had shaped him into something calm but stubborn. The sea, in its cold indifference, mirrored his soul. That spring, something began to change. It started with the catch. One week, the nets came up lighter. The next, there were only a few cod tangled in the mesh, gasping weakly before dying on the deck. Eli thought it was just the tides, but when days turned to weeks and the entire western bay became barren, he felt a strange unease. He began to notice other things too, slick films of color drifting on the surface of the water, as if oil had leaked from some unseen wound. Seabirds that once circled overhead vanished. The air itself tasted different, with a faint metallic bite that lingered on the tongue. Eli mentioned it to the others when he came into town for supplies. The storekeeper shrugged. The younger fisherman said the waters were just shifting, that the fish would return. But Eli's instincts were sharper than theirs. He had lived long enough to know when the ocean was merely restless and when it was trying to warn them. One morning, before sunrise, he decided to sail further than usual. The fog hung thick, and his small boat sliced through the still water with barely a sound. He checked his nets, baited new lines, and waited. But the sea remained lifeless, as though every creature had fled. When he pulled the lines back hours later, there was nothing. He stared down into the dark water and felt an old fear rise within him, the kind that fishermen rarely admit. The sea, once generous, had turned silent. Back on the shore, he dragged his nets toward the cabin. The sand under his boots felt heavier than usual, and a faint chemical odor hung in the air. Near the high tide mark where seaweed usually gathered, something metallic caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a piece of wreckage. The coast was littered with scraps from old ships, iron rings, rusted nails, splintered planks, but this object was larger, half buried in the coarse sand. Eli knelt and brushed away the gravel with his hands. Beneath the wet layers of sea grit, he uncovered a curved shape, thick and crusted with barnacles. The more he scraped, the clearer it became, a massive piece of forged iron, reddish-brown with corrosion. It wasn't just debris. It was the arm of an anchor, easily as thick as his thigh. He followed its curve and saw a link of chain half buried beside it, a link so large it could have held a whale. The chain disappeared into the surf, vanishing beneath the restless water. He stood there for a long time, the wind flapping his coat, staring at the relic. The tide was coming in fast, washing over the metal. He felt an inexplicable chill, not from the cold, but from the sense that something ancient had been stirred. The island had known shipwrecks before. Storms and fog took lives every decade, but this anchor looked older than any vessel that had ever docked there. It seemed to belong to another age altogether. Eli tried to recall stories from his youth. Old sailors talking in the tavern about ships that never made it home, about war convoys that vanished in northern storms. His father once spoke of a ghost ship that sank near the bay during the Cold War, a freighter that was never officially logged, but he had dismissed it as barroom gossip. Now, looking at the iron buried in the sand, he wasn't so sure. He returned the next morning at low tide, bringing a shovel. The dawn light was dim, pale pink behind the clouds. As he dug, the wet sand clung to the metal, releasing bubbles that smelled faintly of rot and fuel. Each scoop revealed more of the chain, stretching farther than he could reach. It was clear the anchor was still attached to something beneath the water, something vast. He paused often to rest, his breath forming mist in the cold air. The more he worked, the stronger his curiosity grew. It wasn't greed or even fear that drove him. It was a need to understand what the sea was hiding. He had spent his whole life respecting its moods, reading its signs, but this was different. This felt deliberate, as if the ocean had chosen this moment to reveal a secret to him alone. When the tide began to rise again, Eli packed his tools and stepped back. The chain disappeared under the advancing waves, swallowed whole. The surface rippled once, then grew still. He lingered, staring at the spot until only the faintest outline of the anchor remained visible through the water. That evening, as he sat by the stove, the wind moaned outside, rattling the windows. He could not stop thinking about what he had seen. The image of the chain stretching into the depths haunted him. It was not merely a piece of metal. It was a message, or a warning, from the sea itself. He opened his weathered journal and wrote a few lines. Found an anchor. Enormous. Still connected. The sea feels different. Heavy. He closed the book and listened. The waves outside struck the rocks with slow, deliberate rhythm, like the beating of a distant heart. The smell of salt and iron filled the air. For the first time in many years, Eli felt the old thrill of discovery, the same feeling that had drawn him to the ocean as a boy. But beneath that thrill, something darker stirred, a quiet, persistent dread that whatever lay at the end of that chain would change everything he thought he knew about these waters. He fell asleep in his chair, the fire dying down to embers. Outside, the tide rose and fell again, whispering against the shore. Under the black water, the chain shifted slightly, straining against the weight of the unseen hull below. And though the island slept, the sea had already begun to stir, with secrets long buried in its cold, silent depths. The morning after the stormy night was quiet, the kind of silence that made even the gulls hesitant to cry out. The tide had drawn back, leaving a damp stretch of beach that glistened like tarnished glass. Eli Wilson stood where he had found the anchor, his boots sinking slightly into the soaked ground. The iron curve still jutted from the sand, a blackened tooth in the mouth of the shore. Overnight, the waves had uncovered a little more of it. The heavy chain gleamed faintly beneath the thin film of water that ran between the pebbles, leading out into the gray horizon. He crouched and touched the metal with the tips of his fingers. It was cold and rough, slick with a layer of salt and sea growth. Beneath the crust of rust, he could feel the thickness of the iron, the craftsmanship of another time. The sight stirred in him something old, like a buried memory of the sea before men learned to tame it with engines and maps. The chain seemed to hum faintly under his touch, or maybe that was just the vibration of the surf. Either way, it felt alive. Eli had always respected the water's secrets. He had seen shipwrecks reduced to splinters, buoys dragged off like toys, and whole coves reshaped by one season of violent tides. But this was something different. It wasn't destruction, it was concealment. The anchor had been hidden here deliberately, its bulk preserved beneath layers of time. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that what lay below was no simple wreck. He spent the next few days returning to the side, always at low tide. Each time he brought a shovel and a pair of gloves, and each time he worked a little farther along the chain. The sand resisted him, heavy with moisture, and the work left him sore. But he felt driven by something he couldn't name. Curiosity, perhaps, or loneliness wearing a new mask. At night, he dreamed of the chain stretching endlessly downward into a world of cold darkness and slow currents where the dead waited without eyes or names. One morning, he found himself not alone. As he knelt by the anchor, scraping the sand away, a voice called from behind him. It was Tom Reeves, one of the younger fishermen from the village. He had come ashore early and spotted Eli's silhouette against the gray water. "You diggin' for treasure, old man?" Tom had said, grinning as he approached. Eli didn't look up. He didn't answer. He didn't like being mocked, and he could already tell that if he explained, the younger man would only laugh. Tom stood there for a moment, then shrugged and walked off. Eli was glad to see him go. This was his discovery, his mystery. By afternoon, his progress revealed nearly 6 feet of the chain. The links were enormous, each one wide enough for him to slip an arm through. They were fused together with corrosion, yet solid despite the centuries. He tried pulling on one, leaning back with his full weight, but it didn't move. The tension beneath it was unyielding, as if the sea itself were holding it in place. He marked the spot with driftwood stakes, then took photographs using the old camera he had kept from Sarah's days. She had loved taking pictures, birds, storms, even the way the sunlight hit the water at dusk. He wondered what she would have thought of this, of him out here digging up ghosts. That evening, as he looked through the photos by lamplight, Eli noticed how the chain vanished into the surf at an angle. It didn't simply trail off straight toward the open ocean. It slanted northeast toward the deeper channel where the tides turned violent. That detail set his mind working. If he could trace the direction, maybe he could find where the chain ended. The thought was dangerous. He was no longer young, and the currents there were treacherous, but it filled him with purpose. The next day, he began preparing for a dive. He hadn't done any real underwater work in decades, not since the summer when he and 2 friends salvaged an old trawler propeller from the southern cove. Most of his gear was gone or rusted, but in his shed he found the remnants: a cracked diving mask, a pair of fins, and an ancient compressor half buried under fishing nets. He spent the afternoon cleaning and repairing it, listening to the hum of the machine as if testing its memory. When he was done, he coiled a long air hose, tested the pressure gauge, and set everything by the boat. That night, the wind rose again, sighing through the eaves. Eli couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the dark sea pulse under the moon. He tried to read but couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to the chain, to what it might lead to. The idea of discovering something hidden, something only he knew, stirred a spark of life he hadn't felt since his youth. But under that spark lay unease. There was a weight in the air, a kind of waiting. The island had always been quiet, but now the silence felt heavier, expectant. The following morning dawned clear. Eli loaded the compressor onto his small boat, secured the hose, and set off along the shore. The air was sharp, the sky pale as bleached steel. As he reached the spot, he dropped anchor and let the boat drift gently with the swell. The water was darker here, the color of bruised glass. He fixed the air hose to his belt and adjusted the mask. Then, with one last look toward the cliffs, he slipped into the sea. The cold was immediate and punishing. It bit through his suit, numbing his fingers and face. Visibility was poor. The silt rose in clouds around him. He followed the chain by touch, running his gloved hand along the links. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of the water pressing on his chest. The chain angled sharply downward, disappearing into a trench that cut through the seabed. When his light caught something massive ahead, he stopped breathing for a moment. It was metal, a wall of it, rising out of the murk like the side of a building. He swam closer, shining his light across the surface. Rust flaked away under his touch, revealing faint traces of paint. There were letters once, but only fragments remained. A, T, R, the rest was gone. The realization hit him slowly. It was a ship, a full-sized vessel buried beneath layers of sand and sediment. Its hull was tilted slightly, wedged against the slope of the seabed. He circled it cautiously, feeling his heartbeat echo in the helmet. Part of the deck had collapsed inward. The railings were twisted, the windows shattered. But, despite the damage, the structure was intact enough to be unmistakably a ship of war. The heavy chain from the beach ended here, bolted to the massive anchor winch near the bow. He swam along the deck, his light grazing over debris, a cracked compass, a torn length of canvas, an old lifeboat upside down and half buried in silt. Everything was still, preserved in eerie quiet. When he reached the side of the hull, his glove brushed against a door partly ajar. A burst of air bubbles escaped as the hinge shifted. He peered inside but could see nothing, only darkness, thick and impenetrable. The smell of metal and salt filled his mask. His instincts told him to go no further. He was low on air, his body shaking from the cold. Reluctantly, he turned back, following the chain toward the surface. Breaking through the waves, he gasped, pulling himself into the boat. His hands trembled, not from exhaustion but from the shock of what he had seen. The water streamed off him, pooling on the deck. The sky above was dull and gray, the horizon fading into mist. For a long while he just sat there, breathing heavily, listening to the slow hiss of the compressor. Beneath the surface, the chain pulled gently against the current, as though trying to call him back. By the time he returned to shore, the sun was already sinking. He hauled the equipment to the shed, hung up his mask, and went inside. His body ached, but his mind was burning. He spread his wet notes on the table, marking the direction of the wreck on an old nautical chart. The discovery should have filled him with triumph, yet what he felt was closer to dread. The ship had been too silent, too well preserved. The ocean had kept it hidden for a reason. That night, he dreamed of the chain again, its link stretching endlessly downward, wrapping around something vast in the darkness. He woke before dawn, the dream still clinging to him like cold water. The air in the cabin was heavy, metallic. Outside, the sea was calm, but he could sense that beneath the surface, the depths were stirring, whispering in a language only the patient could hear. He lit the lamp, opened his journal, and began to write, unaware that this was only the beginning of a discovery that would shake not just his island, but everything he believed about the ocean's silence. For 3 days, Eli could think of nothing but the wreck. The image of the dark hull beneath the water stayed with him like a ghost that refused to leave. Even as he sat by the stove, trying to eat, his thoughts drifted back to the moment when his gloved hand had brushed against the ship's corroded metal. He could still smell the faint stench of rust and something else, something chemical, acrid, unnatural. It clung to his memory like oil on skin. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the broken deck, the gaping doorway, the endless shadows waiting below. He tried to distract himself with ordinary chores. He mended nets, cleaned the hull of his boat, chopped driftwood for the stove. But the sea would not let him rest. It kept drawing his gaze, its dull surface hiding everything he had seen. The weather turned colder and the wind shifted, coming in from the north. On those days, the waves brought with them a slick film that glimmered faintly in the light, a rainbow sheen that spread across the water and then disappeared. The gulls avoided the bay now, circling far out at sea, their cries faint and uneasy. Eli began to suspect that whatever lay inside the wreck was not merely old metal. Something was leaking. The thought gripped him with a quiet dread, but also a grim resolve. He knew that no one would believe him if he tried to explain. People in the village already regarded him as half crazy, a man too old and too solitary to be taken seriously. He would have to find proof, something he could show. So he decided to dive again. This time he prepared more carefully. He oiled the compressor, checked the valves, and cleaned the mask. He packed a waterproof camera, an extra flashlight, and a small crowbar to pry open any compartments. The sky was overcast when he set out, and the water rolled in slow, heavy swells. He followed the line of the chain until he reached the point he had marked on his map. Then he slipped into the sea once more. The cold struck him like knives, but he forced himself downward. The visibility was worse than before. Silt clouded the water, stirred by the tide. He followed the faint shimmer of his flashlight through the murk until the shape of the hull emerged again, looming like a shadowed cliff. The same letters, A, T, and part of another, still showed faintly through the rust. The chain led to the anchor winch exactly as he had left it. He moved along the deck, careful not to disturb too much of the silt. Near the middle of the ship, the metal plating had peeled away, revealing a section of the hold. He swam closer, shining his light inside. What he saw froze him where he hovered. Inside the cavity lay a row of large, cylindrical containers, half buried in sediment. They were steel, thick-walled, and covered with corrosion. Yet, through the film of growth and decay, he could still make out stenciled markings, black letters barely legible, toxic, danger, and what looked like a serial number. One cylinder had a gaping split along its side, from which a slow stream of dark liquid seeped into the water, dispersing in thin tendrils that shimmered under his light. His chest tightened. Every instinct told him to flee, but he couldn't move. The sight was hypnotic, the slow drift of contamination spreading through the water like smoke through air. He took several photographs, hands shaken, the camera light flickering. Then, as he turned, his boot brushed against something soft. He looked down and saw a shape in the silt, a human form, or what remained of one. A skeleton, still clothed in tattered fabric, lay wedged between the containers. The skull had rolled slightly to the side, its jaw gaping. Panic flooded him. He kicked upward, dislodging a cloud of silt, and swam frantically toward the surface. When he finally broke through, gasping, the air burned his lungs. He clung to the side of the boat, shaking uncontrollably, staring down at the spot where the water darkened around the wreck. It took him several minutes to steady himself enough to climb aboard. He sat there, drenched and trembling, his mind racing. He had found what he needed, proof that something dangerous was hidden beneath those waters. But he also knew that now he had seen too much. The body, the containers, the leaking fluid, all of it pointed to something deliberate, not accidental. This ship hadn't simply sunk. It had been abandoned, buried, forgotten by choice. The realization sent a chill deeper than any cold water could. Back on shore, he stripped off the diving suit and rinsed it with fresh water, but the smell lingered, a bitter chemical odor that made his eyes water. He hung the gear on a rack outside and went inside to review the photographs. The images were grainy, murky, but the outlines of the containers were clear enough. On one of them, he could just make out the words, "Property of Us Army." His pulse quickened. What was a military vessel doing here, off an isolated island in the middle of nowhere? He spent the rest of the evening searching through old documents and maps. Most of his papers were decades old, leftovers from when he used to help survey the fishing zones. In a folder marked Shipping Routes 1979-1990, he found several notations about naval operations near the Aleutian chain. One entry, from 1987, caught his attention. Unidentified vessel reported lost north of Atkaya Island, presumed sunk, no salvage attempt due to hazardous cargo. There was no name, no official report, just that single cryptic note. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper. So it was true. There had been a ship, and it had been carrying hazardous material. The rest of the entry was redacted with black ink, but the date and coordinates roughly matched the location of his island. The conclusion was obvious. The wreck he had found was that ship. And the government, for reasons unknown, had chosen to leave it there, to let it rot beneath the sea, leaking poison into the water. Eli couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The wind through the cracks, the whisper of the surf, the groan of the old house settling. He kept imagining the liquid seeping from those containers, spreading silently through the currents, reaching the fish, the kelp, the seabirds. The thought that he had been eating from these waters his entire life made his stomach turn. He rose before dawn and went to the shore. The tide was high, the waves sluggish, but he could see the faint rainbow sheen again, drifting along the surface. Over the next 2 days, his health began to waver. He developed a persistent cough, his throat raw and dry. His eyes burned, and a dull headache settled behind his temples. He told himself it was just exhaustion, or maybe the cold from diving, but deep down, he feared it was something else, something from that leaking hull that had followed him home. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on his growing sense of duty. Someone had to know the truth. Someone had to stop whatever was poisoning the sea. He filled a series of glass jars with water samples from different points along the bay, labeling each one carefully. The liquid had a faint cloudiness to it, and when he held the jars up to the light, he could see tiny iridescent flecks drifting inside. He sealed them and stored them in a crate. Next, he took his camera, extracted the film, and began developing the photographs in the dark corner of his shed. As the images appeared in the chemical bath, he felt both triumph and fear. The containers, the rusted hull, the leaking fluid, all of it was visible. There could be no denial once these pictures were seen, but who would see them? The thought brought him back to reality. The nearest authorities were hundreds of miles away, and the people in his village barely believed half of what he said. He would need to bring the evidence himself. Yet, even as he planned his next move, the dizziness returned. He leaned against the workbench, breathing hard. The smell of the chemicals filled his nostrils, mixing with the ghostly scent of the sea that clung to his clothes. When he finally stumbled outside for air, the world seemed to tilt around him. The horizon shimmered with heat, though the air was cold. The sea rolled slowly, the surface flat and metallic. For the first time, he noticed how the water near the beach no longer smelled of salt, but of something sharper, like burnt rubber. He walked along the shore, his boots crunching over shells. The gulls were gone entirely now, not a single cry breaking the stillness. He paused at the spot where the anchor lay half buried. It looked different, darker, as if the rust itself had deepened overnight. The tide lapped lazily around it, leaving streaks of oily residue on the sand. Eli knelt and touched the surface. It was warm. Not the warmth of sunlight, but of something unnatural beneath. He snatched his hand away and stared at his fingertips. They smelled of metal and acid. As evening fell, clouds gathered low over the horizon, heavy with rain. He went back to the house, his mind burning with plans and fears. He would need to go to the mainland soon to show his evidence to someone who would listen. But for now, he sat by the window, watching the gray waves darken into night. Somewhere beneath them, the wreck lay silent, bleeding its poison into the sea. He felt its presence like a heartbeat beneath the island, slow and steady, pulsing with danger. He took up his pen and wrote again in his journal, his handwriting unsteady. Containers confirmed. Military markings, leakage visible. Possible contamination spreading. Must act. He closed the book, listening to the surf. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier. The drops struck the roof with a steady rhythm, echoing the pulse of the ocean. Eli leaned back and closed his eyes. The smell of the sea filled the room, sharp and bitter. He knew that the water was no longer the same, that it had turned against him. Yet, beneath his fear, another feeling stirred. Determination. He would not let this place die in silence. If no one else would listen, he would make them hear. As the storm gathered, he rose and stepped onto the porch. The wind whipped his coat, and the sea roared faintly in the distance. Somewhere out there, the ship waited, its hull cracking, its toxins seeping slowly outward. Eli looked toward the dark horizon and whispered to the waves, not in prayer, but in defiance. The sea had hidden its secret for too long. Tomorrow, he would begin to drag it into the light. By the time the storm cleared, Eli had made up his mind. He could no longer sit on the island watching the sea grow darker each day, waiting for someone else to notice. The chain and anchor, the leaking wreck, the dead fish floating near the shore, all of it pointed to something far greater than a local problem. The contamination was spreading. He could feel it in the air, in the faint metallic tang that never left his throat. His journal was full, his camera reels developed, his jars sealed with wax and labels. Everything he needed was packed into a wooden crate lashed with rope. He left before dawn, taking the first small ferry to the mainland. The wind was sharp, slicing across the deck, but the sea had gone calm after the storm, unnaturally so. The water's surface looked like a plate of steel, flat, dull, almost lifeless. Eli stood at the railing, the salt stinging his eyes, and watched his island shrink into the distance. It looked peaceful from here, like a forgotten stone in an endless ocean, but he knew what was hidden beneath that calm surface. He knew that beneath those waves, death was gathering in silence. The journey took most of the morning. When he finally reached the port city, it felt like another world, noisy, crowded, and indifferent. The smell of diesel replaced the scent of salt. The docks were lined with warehouses, cranes, and rusted ships unloading containers of goods. It had been years since he had come ashore here, and the pace of it all made him feel old and out of place. Yet he walked with purpose, clutching his crate like a relic. He had promised himself he would not be ignored. His first stop was the local fisheries office, a squat concrete building near the harbor. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and damp paper. A young clerk behind the counter barely looked up as Eli entered, his boots leaving a trail of salt water on the linoleum. The man's expression flickered with mild irritation as Eli set the crate down. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge," Eli said. His voice was rough from the sea and sleepless nights. "It's about contamination. There's a shipwreck off the North Island, leaking something toxic." The clerk blinked, uninterested. "You'll have to fill out a report," he said, sliding a form across the counter. "Environmental issues go to the state office in Anchorage. This isn't our department." Eli clenched his jaw. "This isn't about a dead seal or a broken net, it's a warship. Containers marked as toxic cargo. It's leaking into the sea. The fish are dying." The young man sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from long practice at ignoring urgency. "Sir, we get calls like that all the time. People dump things, oil leaks, boats rust. The Coast Guard surveys that area twice a year. If they didn't find anything, there's nothing to worry about." "Then they didn't look," Eli said quietly. He opened the crate, pulling out one of the sealed jars. Inside, the water shimmered faintly, the iridescent flecks swirling when he moved it. "Look at this. That's not oil. It came from the wreck itself." The clerk stared for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Sir, you can't bring the hazardous material in here," he said, suddenly nervous. "Please, take that outside." Eli's patience thinned. "I'm telling you people, this is dangerous. If this spreads, it won't stop at one bay." But his words fell flat. The clerk mumbled something about calling security, and that was enough to send Eli walking out before they escorted him. He tried the harbor master next, then the regional Coast Guard post. At each door, he was met with polite indifference, bureaucratic smiles, or outright disbelief. One officer even chuckled, saying, "Old stories die hard out there, don't they? Maybe you found a bit of scrap metal from the war." Eli left before he said something he'd regret. By afternoon, he found himself wandering through the streets, exhausted, his crate heavy in his arms. The sky was gray, the kind of colorless pallor that made the city look sick. He sat on a bench near the docks, the gulls circling overhead, and stared at the passing ships. How many of them, he wondered, carried poisons of their own, hidden in their holds, destined for disposal where no one would see? It occurred to him that the sea had always been humanity's garbage pit, the place where guilt was drowned. But the sea never truly forgets. He thought of Sarah, then, how she used to walk with him along the shore, collecting bits of glass worn smooth by waves. She would hold each piece to the light, marveling at its color. "Even broken things can shine," she used to say. That memory stung now. He had come here thinking that truth alone could fix something, but the world he faced was made of thicker glass than any bottle she had ever found. As evening fell, he decided to make one last attempt. There was a small newspaper office near the waterfront, a local paper that often printed stories about environmental issues. He carried the crate there, climbed the narrow steps, and pushed open the door. Inside, the place smelled of ink and dust. 2 reporters sat at their desks typing, while a woman with sharp eyes looked up from behind a stack of papers. "Can I help you?" she asked. Eli nodded slowly. "I have a story," he said, "and proof." He laid out the photographs, the jars, the maps, explaining everything he had seen. The anchor, the chain, the hull with military markings, the leaking containers, the dead fish, the rainbow sheen on the waves. The woman listened at first, her expression unreadable, but as he spoke, her interest faded. She picked up one of the photos, studied it for a few seconds, and then set it down. "It's a compelling story," she said, "but without official confirmation, it's speculation. We can't print accusations against the military. You'd need an expert to verify this." "I need someone to care," Eli said, his voice breaking slightly. "If this continues, there'll be nothing left to fish, nothing left alive." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in the distant way people mean such words when they want a conversation to end. "We get letters like this every week. People claim they've found oil leaks, chemical dumps, old bombs. We'd need a government statement before we could even consider running it." Eli gathered his things in silence. There was nothing more to say. He thanked her anyway, though the words came out hollow. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, blurring through his tired eyes. The ferry back to the island didn't leave until morning, so he found a cheap room above a bar near the docks. The sheets smelled of smoke, the walls stained with damp. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling older than he had ever felt. Somewhere outside, a ship's horn echoed, a long, mournful sound that seemed to come from another world. He closed his eyes and thought of the island again, of the chain vanishing into the sea, of the quiet bay slowly turning poisonous. When he woke before dawn, the decision was made for him. No one would help. No one would believe. If he wanted the truth to be seen, he would have to gather more proof, something undeniable, something even the government couldn't ignore. He packed his belongings and walked to the harbor. The crate felt heavier now, as though the sea itself were weighing it down. By the time he reached the ferry, a fine drizzle had begun to fall. The dock hands moved lazily, smoking and talking in low voices. Eli boarded silently, taking a seat near the stern. As the vessel pulled away from the pier, the city faded behind him, swallowed by fog. Ahead, the open water stretched like a gray mirror. He watched the horizon and thought of the wreck lying beneath it, patient and silent, still leaking its poison into the veins of the world. When he returned to his island, it was mid-afternoon. The sky hung low and heavy, the color of old pewter. The sea was calm again, unnaturally calm. As he stepped onto the dock, he noticed that the air smelled sharper than before. Even the sand seemed darker, damp with a residue that clung to his boots. Near the edge of the water, a small pile of dead crabs lay scattered, their shells cracked and discolored. He crouched to touch one. It crumbled beneath his fingers like ash. Eli straightened and looked toward the spot where the anchor slept beneath the waves. The tide was high, the surface unbroken, but he could feel it. Something had changed since he had been gone. The sea was heavier now, thicker, as though the sickness beneath had spread. He walked back to his cabin without speaking, his mind already working. If no one would listen, then he would become his own witness. He would gather every scrap of evidence he could, no matter the cost. That night, he lit the lamp and sat at his desk. The flame flickered as he opened his journal. The words came slowly, but with a steady rhythm. Authorities refused to investigate. Dismissed evidence. Situation worsening. Must act independently. Will begin direct observation. He set down the pen and stared at the page until the ink dried. Outside, the sea murmured against the rocks, a sound he had always found soothing. But tonight, it felt different. Like the breathing of something alive and restless beneath the surface. The following morning, Eli walked along the beach, marking the water line with stakes, taking fresh samples, noting the spread of the slick. He no longer needed anyone's approval. What he sought now was truth, unfiltered and absolute. Yet, even as he worked, he felt the first true stirrings of fear, not for himself, but for the island, for the life that still clung to its shore. He had seen the face of the danger beneath, and he knew it would not stay hidden forever. The wind shifted again that evening, carrying the sour tang of chemicals across the coast. The gulls did not return. The sea gleamed faintly under the fading light, a sickly sheen like oil. Eli stood on the shore until the last glow of day vanished, then turned back toward his cabin. The island had grown quieter than ever. The world beyond had refused to listen. And so, in the darkness, a single old fisherman prepared to do what no one else would, confront the sea itself and uncover the secret it was trying so hard to keep buried. The wind began to rise that evening, carrying with it the smell of brine and something sharper, almost metallic. Eli sat at his desk with the lamp turned low, his pen resting idle on the page. The faint trembling of the windows warned him of what was coming long before the first roll of thunder crossed the horizon. Storms were nothing new to the island. He had weathered hundreds of them, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that seemed to pulse through the walls, through the ground, even through the water outside. He stepped onto the porch, the sky already splitting with veins of lightning far out to sea. The wind whipped his coat around him, lifting the corners like wings. Out beyond the bay, the sea churned, restless and swollen. He could barely make out the faint outline of the old anchor through the driving rain, a dark shape half buried and half claimed by the tide. He knew that whatever lay connected to it was stirring below, as though the ocean itself were wakened from a long, poisoned sleep. He barely slept that night. When dawn finally broke, gray and trembling, he went down to the shore. The storm had passed, but the damage was worse than he could have imagined. The beach was littered with debris, driftwood, torn nets, and pieces of metal so corroded they looked almost melted. Near the water line, half buried in sand and kelp, something metallic gleamed faintly under the weak morning light. He approached it slowly, his boots sinking with each step. What he found made his stomach tighten. It was a massive cylinder, about 6 feet long and nearly 2 wide, its surface covered with the familiar stenciled markings. Danger, toxic, property of US Army. The storm had ripped it from the wreck and thrown it ashore. A jagged crack ran along its side, oozing a dark, tar-like liquid that spread slowly across the sand. The smell was unbearable, sharp and chemical, stinging the back of his throat. He stumbled back, coughing, as the realization struck him. The storm had freed the poisons from the sea's grip. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching the black fluid seep into the earth. Then, instinct took over. He ran back to his cabin, grabbed his camera, his gloves, a roll of plastic sheeting, and returned to the side. The air burned his eyes and his breathing grew shallow, but he forced himself to work. He photographed the cylinder from every angle, marking the crack, the label, the spreading slick. He scooped samples of the liquid into jars, sealing them tightly, labeling each one. When he finished, he wrapped the cylinder's opening in plastic, tying it with ropes to slow the leak. His hands shook, but he did not stop. By midday, the beach had grown eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to have died. The air hung heavy, tainted with a chemical odor that stretched across the entire cove. Eli noticed the first dead birds shortly after. A pair of gulls lying motionless near the water, their feathers matted and darkened. Then came the fish, washing ashore in dozens, their eyes milky, their bodies coated in the same oily film. He stood among them, the camera heavy in his hands, feeling both fury and despair. That night, he uploaded the photographs to his old laptop and began writing emails. He sent messages to every environmental group he could find: Greenpeace, Ocean Watch, local conservation boards, even university research departments. He attached the images, described the situation, and begged for help. His fingers trembled as he typed, but his words were clear, driven by urgency. "If these materials reach the open current," he wrote, "they will contaminate everything north of the Aleutians. This is not debris. This is an active ecological disaster." He sent dozens of messages and waited. Hours passed, then a day. Most of his emails went unanswered. A few replies trickled in, automated responses, polite acknowledgments, or vague promises to look into the matter. One message came from a graduate student at a marine biology institute who thanked him for the photographs, but warned him not to handle the material without proper protection. Another, from an anonymous address, contained only one line: "You shouldn't be investigating this." Eli ignored the warning. He knew that time was running out. The next morning, another cylinder washed ashore, smaller, dented, but intact. A third followed that afternoon. The tide had turned his island into a dumping ground for ghosts of a war long forgotten. He worked tirelessly, documenting everything, marking coordinates, taking samples, sometimes coughing so hard he had to sit down to breathe. His throat burned constantly now, and a rash had spread across his arms, red and raw from the chemical exposure. Still, he refused to stop. The villagers began to notice. Some came to his cabin demanding to know why the air smelled foul, why their fishing nets came up empty. He told them what he had found, showed them the photographs, the containers, the oily sand. But instead of gratitude, he was met with fear. "You shouldn't mess with what the sea brings," one old man muttered. Another accused him of causing the contamination himself, saying the sea had been fine until he started digging up old metal. They left him alone after that, whispering among themselves, avoiding his cabin like a place cursed. That evening, as the sky bled orange over the horizon, Eli walked the beach alone. The water lapped sluggishly, dark and heavy. In the distance, the remains of the wreck still lay hidden, but now the ocean betrayed its secret piece by piece, vomiting its poison onto the land. He watched the oil slick expand, glinting with strange colors in the dying light, and felt something shift inside him. He realized that this was no longer about curiosity or even survival. It was about truth and the debt humanity owed to the sea it had used as its graveyard. He went home and spent the night writing again, crafting a full report of everything he had discovered. He included the dates, the coordinates, the number of containers, the symptoms of contamination. He wrote of the dead fish, the sickness in the air, the discoloration of the sand. When he finished, he printed copies and packed them with the photographs and samples into waterproof containers. If no one would come to the island, he would make sure the island's story reached them. The next morning, the wind carried a new scent, sweet, cloying, and unnatural. Eli followed it to the shore and found the source. One of the larger containers had ruptured completely overnight. The black fluid had soaked deep into the sand, forming pools that shimmered like oil fires. The water near the shoreline was slick with it. Dead crabs floated belly up, and the rocks were coated in a greasy film. The sight filled him with both dread and determination. He began filming with his old camcorder, narrating in a hoarse voice as he walked among the devastation. "This is proof," he said, the lens trembling in his hand. "Proof they can't ignore." His voice cracked with exhaustion, but his words were steady. He filmed the leaking containers, the dead fish, the oily tide rolling in, each wave carrying more of the same death. He filmed until the battery died, then continued taking notes long into the night by lamplight. It was during that sleepless night that another storm began to build. The wind rose suddenly, rattling the shutters, carrying the same chemical sting through the cracks in the walls. He realized with a cold certainty that if this storm was as strong as the last, the sea would reclaim what it had given and spread it further. The toxins would dissolve into the currents, travel north, and reach other islands, other lives. The thought made him ill. He wanted to warn someone, anyone, but the radio was dead again, and his cell signal was gone. So he did the only thing he could. He went back outside. The rain began to fall in sharp, stinging drops. The waves were already rising, the tide creeping up the beach. The containers shifted with each surge, groaning like dying beasts. He struggled through the storm to secure them again, lashing ropes around the broken metal, driving stakes into the ground. Each gust of wind threatened to knock him down, but he refused to yield. He was soaked, freezing, his breath coming in ragged bursts, but he worked until his hands bled. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the sea was strangely calm again. The beach looked like a battlefield. The ropes had held, but 2 of the containers were gone, swept back into the water. The sand was blackened where the liquid had spilled, the plants wilted and burned. Eli sank to his knees, staring at the destruction. It felt hopeless, and yet, in that hopelessness, he found clarity. He couldn't stop what had already happened, but he could make sure the world saw it. He could force them to face what they had buried. He returned to the cabin, loaded the footage onto his laptop, and began uploading it to every channel he could find. It took hours with the island's slow connection, but he waited, watching the progress bar inch forward. When the upload finished, he sat back, exhausted, and stared out at the horizon. The sea shimmered faintly under the pale light, deceptively still. Somewhere beneath, the wreck waited, its toxic heart still beating. Eli knew he had crossed a line now. There was no going back to silence or peace. He was no longer just a fisherman. He was the voice of the island, of the poisoned sea. He didn't know if anyone would hear him, but it no longer mattered. The truth was out there, floating like a message in a bottle, waiting to be found. Outside, the waves whispered against the rocks, soft and steady, as though mocking his resolve. He stood by the window, his reflection faint in the glass, and whispered back, his voice barely audible. "You hid it well," he said to the sea, "but not forever." The light flickered, the wind shifted, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something like calm. The battle was only beginning, but he had drawn the first breath of defiance against the endless silence of the deep. By the time the first boats appeared on the horizon, Eli had not slept for nearly 2 days. His head ached constantly, his skin itched where the rash had spread across his arms, and his breath came in shallow, rasping gasps. But when he saw the gray silhouettes cutting through the water, his exhaustion fell away, replaced by something sharp and electric. He had done it. His footage had been seen. The storm, the poisons, the containers spilling their filth into the bay. None of it could be ignored any longer. The island was no longer silent. The world was finally coming. The vessels grew larger as they approached. 2 research boats, their white hulls streaked with rust, followed by a third ship painted military gray. When they dropped anchor offshore, smaller crafts were launched, gliding toward the beach. Eli stood waiting near the waterline, the wind tugging at his coat, his boots sinking into the damp sand. He counted at least a dozen figures disembarking, some in bright protective suits, others in plain uniforms. They moved with purpose, speaking into radios, carrying cases of equipment. A woman approached first, her face half hidden behind a respirator mask. "Mr. Wilson?" she called over the wind. He nodded, too tired to speak. She introduced herself as Dr. Clara Jensen, marine biologist and environmental toxicologist. The name barely registered. He only heard the words that came next. "We saw your footage. We're here to assess the contamination." Eli gestured towards the blackened stretch of beach, where the remains of 2 ruptured containers still lay half buried. The chemical sheen shimmered faintly under the sunlight. "You won't need to look far," he said quietly. The scientists fanned out, taking samples of sand and water, photographing the site, marking coordinates. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the familiar stench of decay. Eli watched them work, his body swaying slightly from fatigue. At last, someone was doing what he had begged for. But there was no sense of triumph, only a hollow relief tinged with bitterness. It had taken disaster to make them listen. By afternoon, the military personnel had joined in. They set up barriers and signs marked hazard zone, pushing the villagers back from the beach. The same people who had called Eli mad only days ago now looked at him with a mix of fear and awe. He saw them gathered at a distance, whispering, their faces pale as they watched men in suits and masks comb through their shoreline. One of the officers approached Eli, introducing himself as Captain Rourke, commander of a naval hazardous materials unit. "You've stumbled onto something serious," Rourke said, his expression unreadable. "The cargo you found, it's likely from an old decommissioned disposal operation, late Cold War era, classified transports, the kind of thing that was never supposed to exist." Eli met his gaze, and yet it does. The captain didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his men, ordering them to begin containment procedures. They brought in heavy equipment, cranes, pumps, metal canisters sealed for transport. The machines groaned as they dug into the sand, lifting one of the leaking containers from its shallow grave. It dripped black sludge as it rose, the liquid hissing when it hit the water. A wave of nausea swept through Eli as he watched. By nightfall, floodlights turned the beach into a pale wasteland of light and shadow. The hum of generators filled the air, drowning out the sea's natural rhythm. The scientists worked through the night, logging every detail, while soldiers stood guard along the perimeter. Eli sat by his cabin window, watching the strange glow spread across the cove. His island, quiet, forgotten, pure, had become an emergency zone. The next morning, Dr. Jensen came to see him. She carried a clipboard and a face lined with exhaustion. "We've run preliminary tests," she said. "The contamination levels are severe. Mercury, polychlorinated compounds, heavy metals. Some of these samples are unlike anything we've cataloged before. They've been reacting with salt water for decades, forming new compounds entirely. It's a miracle the ecosystem lasted this long." Eli stared at her, his throat tight. "So it's true? The sea's been poisoned for years." "Yes," she said softly, "and not just here. If our data's right, the current carried traces far beyond this island. You weren't just fighting for your home, Mr. Wilson. You've uncovered something much larger." He turned toward the window, watching the waves roll under the dull light. "I wasn't trying to uncover anything," he said after a moment. "I was just trying to understand why the fish stopped biting." Jensen didn't reply. She only looked at him for a long time, her expression caught between admiration and pity, before she returned to the beach. In the days that followed, more teams arrived. Journalists, scientists, government inspectors. Tents were erected along the shoreline, cameras pointed at the wreckage. News drones hovered above the bay, broadcasting the grim sight to viewers across the country. Reporters shouted questions at Eli whenever they saw him walking the beach. How long had he known? Why hadn't he called sooner? Did he realize he'd stumbled upon a federal scandal? He said little, offering only fragments of truth. "The sea told me," he once muttered, and the reporters laughed, thinking it was a metaphor. It wasn't. Within a week, the island was declared a restricted site. The government issued statements acknowledging historical mismanagement of military waste. They promised full cleanup operations and compensation for residents. None of it sounded sincere to Eli. The same authorities who had ignored his warnings were now standing in front of cameras pretending to be saviors. He watched their polished speeches from his cabin, the flicker of the television lighting his tired face, and felt an old anger stir. At night, he still couldn't sleep. The sound of the pumps running along the beach filled the air with a mechanical heartbeat. Sometimes he wandered down to the shore, keeping to the shadows, watching the soldiers load sealed barrels onto barges. The work was slow, dangerous, and endless. Men moved under the harsh glare of lights, their bodies reduced to silhouettes. Occasionally, he heard one of them curse as they hauled another corroded drum from the mud. Each one was a relic of deceit, a piece of history the world had chosen to bury. Dr. Jensen sought him out again during one of those sleepless nights. She found him sitting on a rock overlooking the bay, the wind tugging at his hair. "You should see a doctor," she said gently. "You've been exposed to toxins longer than anyone here. The coughing, the rash, it's not safe." He shook his head. "I'll see to it when this is over." "It might already be too late." He smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Then I'll die knowing I did something worth dying for." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. They sat in silence, the waves whispering below them. The cleanup lasted for weeks. Teams dredged the seabed, pulling up twisted metal, shattered crates, and more sealed drums marked with fading stencils. Some disintegrated as soon as they touched air, releasing fumes that sent men running for cover. Eli watched from a distance, wrapped in a blanket, coughing into his sleeve. He saw helicopters ferrying barrels to waiting ships, cranes lowering cages of waste into containment tanks. The bay that had once shimmered with life now looked like an industrial scar. Still, progress was visible. The oily sheen on the water began to thin. The smell in the air grew weaker. Patches of clean sand reappeared along the beach. For the first time in months, Eli saw a single gull circle overhead, hesitating before landing near the surf. It pecked at the ground, then flew off again, startled by the movement of a nearby worker. But, for that brief moment, hope returned. The news called Eli a hero. Headlines described him as the lone fisherman who exposed a government cover-up. Reporters sent letters asking for interviews, book deals, documentaries. He ignored them all. Fame was meaningless to him. He hadn't wanted glory, only truth. And now that truth was everywhere, shouted through every screen, dissected by every voice, but none of them understood the cost. The day the final container was removed, a crowd gathered near the docks. Government officials gave speeches, promising restoration funds and environmental reforms. Eli stood at the edge of the crowd, leaning on a cane. The cough had worsened and the rash spread along his neck, but he refused to stay inside. He wanted to see the end of it with his own eyes. When the last barrel was lifted onto the barge, applause broke out. The officials smiled, shaking hands, posing for photographs. Eli only watched the horizon. The sea looked clearer now, its surface bright under the sunlight. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered beneath, unseen but waiting. That night, he returned to his cabin and sat by the window. The beach was quiet again, lit by the pale moon. The tents were gone, the machinery silent. For the first time in months, he could hear the natural rhythm of the waves, soft and steady against the shore. It should have comforted him, but it didn't. He felt hollow, as though the sea had taken something from him in exchange for its truth. He coughed until his chest burned, then poured himself a small measure of whiskey. His reflection in the glass was gaunt, his eyes sunken. The doctor from the mainland had warned him the exposure might be irreversible. It didn't matter. He had made his peace with it. He turned back to the window and watched the tide creep in, washing over the dark stains that still clung faintly to the sand. Somewhere out there, beneath miles of black water, the ship still rested, stripped and empty now, but still present, still part of the ocean's memory. He imagined it slowly breaking apart, piece by piece, until the sea claimed it fully. And in that thought, he found a strange sense of balance. The sea forgets nothing, but it forgives in its own way, through erasure and time. As he drifted toward sleep, the sound of distant machinery echoed faintly from the harbor, the last remnants of the cleanup crew leaving. Soon, even they would be gone. The world would move on to another story, another disaster, and his island would fade back into obscurity. But he knew he would never forget. He had seen the truth beneath the waves, and it had marked him. The fight was over, but the cost was written into his very blood. When dawn came, the sky blushed pale over the horizon. The sea shimmered like glass, deceptively calm, as if nothing had ever happened. Eli stood on the porch, leaning heavily on the railing, and watched the sunlight crawl across the water. The gulls had returned in small numbers, circling above, their cries sharp and alive. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a faint smile. The sea was healing, perhaps slowly, perhaps imperfectly, but healing nonetheless. He turned toward the cabin, his body heavy, but his spirit lightened by a fragile peace. The fight for truth had nearly broken him, but it had also saved what mattered most. He had given everything he had to bring the buried sins of the past into the light. And though the world might forget his name in time, the island would remember. The sea would remember. In the endless rhythm of the tides, his struggle would remain, a quiet echo beneath the waves, a whisper of defiance carried on every returning wind. The morning after the last cleanup ship departed, the island was quieter than it had been in years. The faint hum of engines that had filled the air for weeks was gone, replaced once again by the low breathing of the sea. The waves rolled in slowly, brushing against the pale sand as if testing whether the world had finally grown still. Eli woke to the sound of gulls for the first time in months, their distant cries echoing across the cliffs. For a moment, lying in his narrow bed, he thought it might all have been a long dream. The wreck, the poison, the flashing lights of the cameras. But when he rose and looked out the window, the truth stood waiting, as steady as the tide. The beach bore its scars plainly. The sand was lighter in some places, almost bleached where the chemicals had been scrubbed away. In others, dark stains clung stubbornly to the rock, reminders of what had once leaked into the earth. The wind carried a different smell now, cleaner, though still touched by something metallic beneath. The air felt thinner, freer, and yet Eli couldn't shake the sense that the island itself had aged, as if it had shared in his suffering. He dressed slowly, his movements deliberate. His body had become a map of pain. The cough came more often now, his breath shallow, and his hands trembled when he tried to button his coat. But he ignored it. He had never been one to surrender to weakness, and he would not start now. He stepped outside, squinting into the pale morning light. The sea stretched out before him, smooth and cold, the horizon sharp as a blade. Down by the water, small waves lapped against the remnants of the wooden stakes that once marked the containment zones. Someone had left a sign driven into the sand. Cleaned area. Hazard removed. It stood crookedly, already weathering under the salt wind. Eli walked past it without slowing. He didn't need a sign to tell him that danger had lived here. He could still feel it underfoot, in the earth, in the air that burned slightly when he drew it deep into his lungs. He reached the place where he had first found the anchor. The sea had reclaimed most of it now. Only a curve of rusted iron showed above the sand, glinting faintly in the sunlight. Around it, the tide pooled and whispered. He crouched beside it, resting a hand on the cool metal. It had all begun here, with this relic from another age, this hand reaching up from the deep. He remembered that first morning, the damp air, the sound of the gulls, the feeling that the sea was holding its breath. He had been right. The ocean had indeed been waiting to exhale. He sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of the waves breaking softly against the shore. Each crash carried with it a rhythm he had known his entire life, a heartbeat older than humanity. It comforted him. The sea forgives nothing, but it forgets nothing either. It takes what men try to bury and eventually brings it back to the surface. That was its truth, its form of justice. And he, a simple fisherman, had been its witness. As the tide began to rise, Eli stood and turned back toward the cabin. The path was lined with patches of new grass pushing through the sand. The cleanup teams had left the island weeks ago, but already nature was trying to heal the wound. A few villagers had returned too, rebuilding their small homes near the cliffs. When they saw him walking back, they raised their hands in quiet greeting. No one called him crazy anymore. Some nodded with gratitude, others with the solemn respect reserved for the dying. Eli answered each gesture with a faint smile. His house smelled of salt and old wood. On the table lay his weathered journal, its pages filled from beginning to end with notes, sketches, coordinates, and fragments of thought. It had become his companion through everything, the only witness to the long descent into the depths. He flipped it open and ran his fingers over the ink, now smudged in places by water and age. He had thought of sending it to someone, Dr. Jensen perhaps, or one of the newspapers, but he couldn't bring himself to let it go. This was not a story for the world anymore. It was for the island, for the sea. When he was gone, the waves could decide what to do with it. That afternoon he went down to the shore again, carrying a small wooden box. Inside it were a few photographs, the images he had taken of the wreck, the containers, the poisoned water. He had printed extra copies, but decided to keep only these. He walked to a flat stone near the cliff's edge where the wind blew strongest and set the box down. With slow, deliberate movements, he opened it and placed one photograph after another into the wind. They scattered like birds, tumbling over the rocks before the sea carried them away. He watched until the last one vanished beneath the waves. By evening, a thin fog rolled in from the west. Eli sat by his window, the lamp flickering behind him, and watched it creep across the bay. It wrapped around the coastline like a shroud, softening every edge, blurring the scars. He felt strangely at peace. The world beyond the island would move on, new stories, new crises, but here the sea would continue its eternal rhythm, cleansing and consuming in equal measure. He took another sip of whiskey, letting its warmth ease the pain in his chest. When night fell, he stepped outside once more. The stars were faint, veiled by the mist, but the moon shone clearly, a pale coin above the horizon. The tide was high again, brushing against the rocks where the anchor once stood. He could hear the faint sound of crabs scuttling through the shallows, the first signs of life returning. It was enough. The sea was mending itself, even if he would not. He thought of Dr. Jensen and her quiet words on the beach. You weren't just fighting for your home. You uncovered something larger. At the time, he hadn't known what to say. Now he understood. The fight had never been about him or even the island. It was about the bond between man and the sea, the silent agreement that had existed for centuries and had been broken by greed and neglect. He had been chosen, perhaps by chance, perhaps by something deeper, to remind the world of that debt. The cough came again, harder this time. He leaned against the railing, gripping it until the wave passed. When it did, he tasted iron on his tongue. The cold air burned his lungs, but he didn't care. He looked out at the horizon where the sea met the sky and thought of Sarah. He imagined her standing there, barefoot on the sand as she used to, the wind catching her hair. For a moment, he could almost hear her laughter carried by the tide. He smiled, and the years between them fell away like mist. He stayed outside until the chill grew deep, then returned to the cabin. The lamp still burned softly, casting a golden circle of light across the table. He sat down and opened his journal one last time. On the final page, beneath the date, he wrote in careful, steady letters, "The sea has its own memory. It keeps what we give it until we are ready to face it again." He closed the book gently and set it beside the lamp. The fire in the stove had burned low, the coals glowing red. He sat back in his chair, listening to the slow ticking of the clock and the distant sigh of the waves. His eyelids grew heavy, the weight of exhaustion finally catching up with him. The last thought that crossed his mind was not of fear or regret, but of gratitude, that he had lived long enough to hear the sea's confession and to answer it in kind. When dawn came, the island was bathed in silver light. The door of the cabin stood slightly ajar, the wind stirring the pages of the open journal. Outside, the tide had risen high, lapping at the stones where Eli had often stood. A single gull wheeled above the water, calling out once before disappearing into the brightening sky. The beach lay clean and quiet, the air crisp and new. The ocean had claimed what was its own and left behind only silence, peaceful, endless, and deep. Far beneath the surface, the wreck rested finally undisturbed, its twisted frame now a home for the slow-growing coral and the small, darting fish returning to the bay. The poison had faded, dissolved into time, and the sea had begun its long work of forgetting. Above, the waves rolled gently over the place where a fisherman had once listened to their voice and dared to speak back. His footprints were gone, washed away by the same tide that had carried his warnings to the world. Yet, in the rhythm of the surf, in the hush between each wave, there lingered the faintest echo of his defiance, a whisper of gratitude and resolve that would live as long as the sea itself. And so the island breathed again. The gulls returned. The grass grew taller near the cliffs. The world resumed its quiet, indifferent turning. But for those who knew where to look, those who remembered the fisherman and the poisoned bay, the ocean's calm would never again feel entirely innocent. For somewhere within its endless depths, the memory of what had been buried and of the man who had unearthed it would remain forever, murmuring softly beneath the silence after the storm. If you were hooked by this story, make sure to hit subscribe right now. You don't want to miss what's coming next. The next episode will change the way you see everything. Watch the next video on your screen and share this one with a friend. Let's see how many people can handle the truth behind this discovery.